Well, hello and welcome back to the Regiment Chronicles. I'm Grayson, and thanks for joining us here for episode 5. Today we're going to be talking about language and its importance, its significance in schools. But first, I want to introduce my singular guest for today, Jace.
Howdy, howdy.
And like I said, we're going to be talking about language. We had my Spanish teacher, Mr. Dawson, on last episode for episode 4, and we talked about language and his experience with teaching. But what I want to get into today is more so the student experience of language. So I've got a few questions here for Jason that we can both talk about. I personally have a really significant interest in language. I currently speak, obviously, English, but I have studied Spanish for about 5 years. I also am learning Italian and German. And what about you, Jace?
I've studied Spanish for, let's see, it's probably about 5 years, although I've been introduced to it for longer than that. Right now I'm teaching myself Danish.
Oh, wow.
And I've certainly spent a decent amount of time at least just looking at other languages and kind of linguistics generally as a field, because it is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did a independent study at my school in artificial languages. So artificial languages really is a broader study of language in general. It's more so a study of how languages come to be, how they evolve, the phonetics of languages. That's a really big part of it. So how the sound systems of humans have changed the way that we can speak. So you can look at, for instance, the International Phonetic Alphabet and see all of the sounds that humans can make. And obviously, that's not included in every language, but it definitely a significant impact. And then also, it's a study of how languages, like I mentioned, evolve from roots and things like that. And that's really important because when we think about roots in English, we think about a word from maybe Latin or Greek that comes on and that we add endings to, or that slightly changes the meaning. But it's interesting to see the patterns between languages, how there are common roots between these things. So, for instance, life is typically represented by air or breath, as opposed to what we might think of as, greenery or, blood or things like that. It's interesting that it's represented by air in most cultures. But then I wanted to ask you what your experience is in language so far. How has it changed maybe your view of the world, and how have you benefited from learning a language?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? And I was thinking about it. I was thinking about it just the other day. Like being able to look at a word, and kind of being able to take a guess at what that word would mean,
Right.
just based off of prior knowledge of like Latin roots, for example, and being able to take a guess at what the word is very, very interesting. So, for example, in my English class, on a multiple choice test, there was a word used. The word was, I believe, it was malportant.
Mm.
And of course, I have never heard the word malportant before, because malportant is a very niche word that probably isn't even in the dictionary. It was just
Right.
it was an older passage. It was like 1800s. But Latin roots, and even just like from Spanish, for example, mal is bad in most of those languages, or like negative in some way, right? And important, of course, being able to kind of look at that, well, that is generally some sort of like omen or some sort of saying or like a message or a communication. And so being able to put those together, oh, this is probably like a bad omen is probably what this means.
Right.
And, that's very useful when you're trying to decipher words that you don't know even in your own language. And so being able to apply, the general basis of your general knowledge to more specific, your own experiences, your own language is very, very, very helpful.
Right, and that's interesting how our languages still are so connected, although our cultures are so varying and so different. Of course, the American culture and the British culture have, connections to, the rest of Europe, including Spain, and now, of course, the Spanish-speaking countries in Central America, South America, Mexico, etc. But it's interesting that we still have such strong connections with our language that when we speak, we are obviously not understanding each other because they have deferred over time, but there are still the baseline, roots and the baseline phonetic and structural features that we share between our languages, despite the fact that they have evolved for hundreds of years apart from each other. But that they still have these remnants, if you will, from the where they evolved from. But what I want to talk about next, we've been talking about Spanish and Romance languages, and I wanted to get your opinion, and I'll talk on it as well, but the importance of Spanish in the American school systems. Of course, we have Mexico as a close neighbor, but then also we have, a lot of people forget, we have a massive Spanish-speaking population in the United States, and it's our most spoken language in terms of schools that teach a language. If a language, or if a school has a language program, it probably has Spanish, as you know. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Jace.
Well, I mean, I think to start, the point you bring up about, Mexico being our closest neighbor is very, very relevant. I feel like for most people, if you're choosing to learn a language, you should probably learn Spanish. It's going to be the most applicable. You'll probably meet the most Spanish speakers, generally speaking,
Right.
as far as neighbors go. And it still has some usefulness abroad if you go to Europe, for example, right? It's useful in that regard. It's useful in the context of being able to kind of guess at other Romance languages. And, it's a relatively easy language to learn as compared to, like, I don't know, Mandarin or even English for that matter, right?
Right, exactly.
And similarly, like French in schools as well. It kind of that same thing. Even to our north, like Quebec, right?
Right.
They do have a slightly different version of French, but it's still very, 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 very similar. 99% similar, 95% similar, whatever. And so, having some exposure to that, being able to go to Europe. I mean, the French will bully you if you try and speak French to them, especially if you do it poorly. But it's still, useful to know. Reading signs, just being able to generally be more of a active traveler and being able to talk to people who may speak that language in their own language, which is a very powerful, meaningful thing to those people.
Right. Yeah, I think the word that I might use to describe that is a global citizen. And I think a part of what is becoming a global citizen as we continue to globalize, of course, 200, 300 years ago, we were significantly less connected, at least between the continents. But it's interesting that now, as we continue to globalize, jobs are really becoming more of an international market, where before, I think when you think about 400, 500 years ago, you were definitely relegated to the country that you came from, and probably in more often cases, just the town or the city or the province that you came from, you were relegated to in terms of jobs. But now, as we enter this kind of new global society, I think jobs are becoming more of an international facet. And a part of that is learning languages, because, of course, we're not a one language world.
Yeah. I think there's two interesting points I bring up about that. And one of them is that I read a really interesting study. I don't remember who it was done by, like a month or two ago. And the study basically said, it wasn't really a study. It was more of like an op-ed by a linguist, PhD. And he was basically arguing that, in the next hundreds of years or thousands of years, but still like near-ish future, right? With the advent of the internet, and assuming there's no other drastic changes, his basic argument was that, generally, especially with the internet, the idea of language will kind of begin to fade, and over a long enough time period, ultimately, we actually might kind of regress more towards one, like, more very central language that incorporates lots of elements of different languages,
Right.
especially through, diffusion along the internet. But it's just kind of one larger lingua franca. And the second point I bring up to that is, like, we already see this in a lot of languages. Like Spanish, for example, borrows a lot of English words, like newer slang terms,
Right.
without changing anything now. And I think the funniest example of this is I was playing a game the other night, and I was in a voice chat, and these people were speaking Spanish, and they had a native Mexican accent, and they were speaking very quickly, very fluently. I admit I could not really understand most of what they were saying, but we're in a very high stress situation in this game, and one of them uses a English expletive in the middle of a Spanish sentence, right?
Right.
And I thought that was very interesting. I was thinking about it, I was talking about it with my friend, and yeah, it stood out as something that you would really only pick up, being not even like a global citizen per se, but just being connected to people who speak
Right.
different languages and being in an environment where you're just constantly exposed to that other language. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that goes to show, like I mentioned, how connected we truly are today with, of course, the advent of the internet and and online exchanges. Even though you may never visit another country, another continent, even another state, some people don't still. You can still have such strong access to the outside world, outside of your home nation, to other languages, to other to other cultures, and that's what I wanted to get
Yep.
into next. What the importance of languages to kind of culture and religion, but then also a lot of people think of nations. When they hear the word nation, they think of a country. Really, when I think of a country, I think of a state, the governmental organization.
Yes.
A
Yes.
nation is more so a group of people. So I wanted to ask your opinion on the importance of languages to nations.
Yeah. I think generally speaking, you could make the argument that most nations probably are unified under one language.
Right,
Or if they're not, they're unified under a couple languages that are very, very closely related in
right,
terms of, roots, origins. And those are probably more large nations that you're considering, right? But yeah, individual groups, individual cultures, especially, usually all have their own language, or at least they're part of a larger language that if you were to take someone from like Louisiana, for example, who speaks in that sort of vernacular and that dialect, and you were to set them up in a conversation with someone who's very, very, very Cockney, right?
right.
Um, Both of those are English. They could probably not understand very much of what the other person is saying, and that's just an example of kind of how, you know, even within a language, you still have these cultures, you still have these nations, even. Um, but generally, the nation, the group of people, the culture still identifies off of some sort of linguistic barrier, and I would argue that any culture you could probably find some linguistic determination that makes it different from other cultures, even if it's not strictly the language as a whole, but like a dialect, as I kind of mentioned there.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, and I think one thing that goes to show that language is a part of culture and that language is a part of understanding a culture is that when you take the time to learn a language, I've seen it firsthand. When you take the time to learn a language, you really bring joy to other people that speak that language. There's been many studies that show that the comfort level, the dopamine levels that people feel when people speak their native tongue are really strongly associated. And it's interesting because there are different levels of language learning, of course. And Mr. Dawson spoke about this on my last episode, but he's talked about how understanding a language at a basic level is one thing, understanding, a few words, a few phrases to get by. But then when you really start to understand the idiomatic expressions and the terms they use that are maybe not directly translatable, it really kind of gets to the heart of the language. And I think that, like I mentioned, goes to show how language and culture are connected, because when people are using these idiomatic expressions, it's guiding what they're doing. There's been, like I mentioned, several studies that show correlations between language and the brain, and also how languages that don't have specific tenses have different reactions to things. For instance, in China, they don't have a future tense, so they're better money savers because they don't see the future as distant. They see it as right now. They see that they need to, save money. So it's interesting that languages and cultures have become so intertwined because communication is everything. When you speak to someone, when you relay an idea, when you think, I'm thinking in English right now, my native tongue, and I think another thing that shows that is that when you learn a language enough, you start to dream in that language, right? And I think that shows you how connected communication is to your general thinking process.
For sure.
Of course there's instinctual, thoughts that we have about that I must breathe, that I must drink, but when you're thinking more intellectually, more consciously, it's in a language.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for me, the point at which I would say I'm definitely not fluent in Spanish, but I would say the point at which I became like conversationally fluent is in like, I can talk to anybody in Spanish fluently about any conversation, any topic that would come up in normal
Right.
conversation, anything that you'd discuss with someone on the streets or in any, social context. And then, a pretty good chunk of stuff outside of that. I'd say the point at which I really became good to that level would definitely be when and I don't realize, exactly when that was, but it was sometime a few years in when I realized I was doing like an assignment for my Spanish class, and I realized I wasn't thinking in English for it. I was thinking through it in Spanish
Spanish,
words
right.
without any English thought. And kind of when you make that transition, that's kind of that tipping point that you have to get over, um, to really kind of be able to understand, exactly what's going on with the language.
Right, directly translating every word, it's not the same speed, and I know that. I know that I felt the same thing that you did. I didn't feel it as much as becoming like conversationally fluent as if I knew that, but what I felt was that before this experience that I was taking each word for what it was, as opposed to taking larger bulks of sentences and saying, okay, each of these words might have a direct translation into English, but it's going to sound better if I say it in this
Well,
way because I think about it in
yeah,
Spanish.
yeah. It's it's the idea that like you could hear the word you could hear un coche, and if you're maybe a an early learner of Spanish, you would think oh, a car, and then you might picture a car in your head.
Right.
But like, since you're pretty far to Spanish, I imagine you probably did not translate it to car. You probably just pictured a car
Right.
without needing to, make that conscious translation. Um, and that's kind of that's a kind of interesting tipping point. That's kind of interesting transition when you can kind of start to be able to conceptualize the language in its own right as its own language and interpret the meaning of a word rather than interpreting the translation of the word.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think going off of what I said before, I think I feel more when I'm speaking in basic Spanish. When I start to go on to advanced, then I go back to that direct translation because I'm
Yeah,
using
yeah.
these advanced words, and now I'm starting to use transitions and things, but that doesn't come as naturally to me. But when I'm in my basic Spanish mode, I find that even if I haven't been directly trained, for instance, ser versus estar, those are two verbs in Spanish, both of them mean to be. I have
Hmm.
had training on which to use, but it's been many, many years, and I haven't reviewed that in a long time. I know the basic structure in terms of emotions when you use estar, or maybe permanence when you
Hmm.
use ser, right? But what I notice now is that even when I haven't had this direct training, I can hear when someone uses it wrong, even if it wasn't explicitly said to be wrong. I can
Hmm.
hear the difference because I've heard a lot of people speaking Spanish in the correct way. And when I hear someone use it, it's kind of like, it's a little bit of a visceral response. Oh, that's a little bit wrong. And, I don't think I directly say that out loud. I'm like, oh, you're saying that wrong. And I don't think that I
Well,
analyze it as wrong all the time, but I think I feel it more than I think.
yeah, for sure. And this idea that, like, yeah, if I were to say, oh, yeah, I were happy yesterday,
Right.
that just sounds wrong to you as an English speaker. And you can pick that out. And you kind of start to do the same thing with other languages where the word is correct. Were is a past tense describing word in English, right?
Right.
You were happy, but it's the wrong conjugation of it, if you will. You wouldn't say I were happy, you would say I was happy.
Right.
And although that may not seem so obvious to someone learning the language, once you understand it, once you kind of have that innate feel for it, as you
Right.
say, you kind of pick that out. And even as a speaker, you still know what they're saying.
Right.
You
Of
still know what
course.
they mean if they were to speak like that. It's just not quite right.
Yeah, and I think what you just mentioned demonstrates that speaking really is kind of the most important aspect of language, speaking and listening. And that's why there's so many illiterate people, but that fraction of illiterate people is very minuscule in comparison to the people that can't speak or
Yeah.
listen to a language.
Well, there's an interesting thing too about that, right? Like, not every language is like this. Actually, there's an interesting argument about that too. But like, English has a lot of inflection used in the language to
Right.
determine meaning, and this is actually, not as common in other languages, but it is definitely still very common in a lot of languages. But like, if you were to take the sentence, "I never said he stole my money," right? At a pretty common level. Oh, someone's talking about, they're like making up an excuse, or they're in a conversation. I never said he stole my money. But if you change the inflection of that without changing anything else, you can come up with a different meaning of the sentence for every single word you inflect. For
Right.
example, I never said he stole my money.
Right.
I never said he stole my money. I never said he stole my money. And so I didn't change any words there, but I did change the inflection of the word. And that
Right.
did create an entirely new meaning for the sentence. And you, as an English speaker, and I'm sure anybody listening, you inherently know that that is a different meaning. You
Right.
got a different feeling from the sentence, and you probably are making up a scenario in your head where that inflection makes sense, or what the meaning change is. For example, I never said he stole my money might imply that it was someone else who stole the money, but I
Right.
never said he stole my money implies that it was him who stole the money.
Right.
Um, and so you're changing the meaning of the sentence, sometimes dramatically, by simply changing how you're saying a word. And that's something that you can only get a feel for by speaking the language.
Right, yeah, and I think English is a strong example of that, but I think even stronger, I've seen in just a basic learning of Chinese, that accents make all the difference. In English, you might have a sentence that has inflection on it that changes the meaning in a way, in terms of the purpose of the sentence.
Yeah.
But directly, each of the words don't mean the same thing. In Chinese, for instance, the word "wen," W-E-N, in pinyin, obviously it's a Chinese character, but there are four different words that are, if you were to say it at face value, "wen." There are four different accents that you can add to the word "wen" and change it dramatically. So that could go from saying language, like you say Zhongwen, which is the Chinese language, but you can change it to something completely different just with a simple accent change. And I think when Chinese speakers hear Chinese speakers say just a slight inflection, they can instantly hear it. Just like you were mentioning, an English speaker listening right now would have been able to tell what you were meaning by the sentence when you changed the inflection. So I think inflection and speaking, it's not necessarily common, but when it occurs in a language, you definitely note that there's a really strong importance to it, that it has a really strong meaning change.
And yeah, I mean, to my point, I think, like, yeah, that's something that is really hard to pick up on in any language, without practice, because and that can be confusing too, because there's no textbook way, there's no like concrete educational
Right.
scholarly way necessarily to define that so much as an emotional thing, right? And that just comes from, understanding people and what they mean. And that, fundamentally, that's what a language is. It's understanding people, and it's a way of people communicating, and it's what people are saying.
Yeah, and I think what Mr. Dawson mentioned was similar along that point, is that there is no substitute for speaking with real people. There's no substitute for hearing the language in its natural sense. Chinese might be hard to learn, but if you were placed in China and you were forced to learn the language, and you were given a few months, and, obviously you can't just learn the language by hearing it, you have to have some supplementation. But if you were given that, you're going to need it for surviving. And I think that again goes to show the survivability and the strength of the human mind, but also that languages are not impossible tasks to overcome. So for all the listeners right now that are thinking about learning a language, it's not an impossible task, even if you're not young. They say that when you're young, you should learn a language. That's true. You have neuroplasticity in your brain. It's physically able to absorb information better than an adult brain, but that does not mean that you cannot learn a language. So I think it goes to show again how the brain and language are connected. But one thing I want to talk about with you next is the general importance of learning a language for life. We talked about jobs earlier, but maybe you can think of some other ways that learning a language, whether you're young or not, is important to life in general.
Well, yeah, we talked about, being a global citizen. It, of course, has job applications. Being bilingual is very, very useful for certain jobs, certain fields. It's always useful for traveling, to a place where that language is spoken, or to a place where a different language is spoken. Understanding how languages work in a more broad context is still useful. I went to Italy for a month over the summer. I did not speak any Italian going there. I honestly didn't even prepare at all. But I spoke Spanish pretty dang well, and that honestly helped me figure out probably, 20% to 50% to 80% of the words I saw in like signs, because they're not exactly the same, but they're similar enough that you can kind of figure out the roots, since they're all similar languages. And also, as with all things, as with any learning a language, learning, advanced mathematics, learning how to write an essay, learning science, even if you will never apply that to anything of direct use, never a job, never anything, or you won't even study anymore, it teaches, critical thinking. It teaches how to be a learner, and being able to do that is more valuable, arguably, than anything else. And as with all higher education, there's no purpose to doing it other than that it makes you a more well-rounded, more well-versed, better, more open-minded learner, more open-minded human. And that's a benefit that everybody should be able to take advantage of.
Well, I want to thank Jace for being on the program, and I want to wrap up this episode with just a few words of wisdom, maybe, Jace, that you have in your experience with learning language for how people who are learning a language but do not keep up with it. So an example of that could be students over the summer. How can they maintain their language? I asked the same question to Mr. Dawson. I want to ask it to you.
Well, in response to that question, I think it's very, very important to at least keep up with it, with some level of consistency. And that could be through doing, something as simple as Duolingo, just kind of keeping your mind in it. I mean, Duolingo is not going to teach you the language, really, but it'll help kind of keep you in that mindset every so often. Something a lot of my Spanish teachers have always recommended is to watch TV or listen to music in that language, whether to actually learn more words or even to just kind of keep yourself in that mindset, like I said. But if you're learning Spanish, find like a Spanish music station or like a playlist or something and just listen to it for a bit. You can still find entertainment value in that, of course, because it's still music. It's still, pleasing. And that sometimes makes it very easy to kind of listen for words, and you kind of pick things out and you kind of learn it. And, those two things, a little bit of Duolingo, a little bit of learning, quote unquote, and then a little bit of, some auxiliary sources, or just some being exposed to the culture and being exposed to the language. Those are all things that, you could take 5 minutes a day. You could take 2 minutes a day. You could take, one song per day. You could take a whole, hour of your morning. You could do it once a week. You could do it once a month. You could get all your friends together and you could watch a film in another language. It doesn't even have to be a film that it's for a language you're learning, but it's probably better if it was. But you could even just watch something from another country in another language that you think is interesting and just try and kind of analyze if there's any similar cognates, any similar words, homophones, that you could pick out.
No, I think that's important, and like you mentioned, consistency and getting it into your routine are really important. Well, I want to thank Jace for being on the program, and I want to thank you for listening. Be sure to check out episode 6 coming this weekend. As always, tell someone you love them, make someone smile, and goodbye.